before getting to the special brand of life advice from Jordan Burnt Peterson, let's take a peek at what's new on his Twitter. I mean X. Whatever. I'm not sure how I'm going to show this visually, but there's actually been days when he hasn't tweeted or retweeted a thing. Like, on the day I screenshot this, July 28th, the most recent activity was a couple days ago. The days he is active, he's as post-happy as ever, so it probably isn't that he's trying to moderate his usage. It seems more likely that he's just busy doing something else. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Anyways, at time of writing this, his new top image to use, switching gears entirely from the Joker and clowns, was this shoebill stork. From cancel culture to climate change to awful authors, this social justice bird can do it all. And of course, it's in that weird pseudo-poetic format. But Peterson has also branched out into designing things from other entities, like the woke mob or the more ominous Guess Who. And by the way, all of those tweets I just showed you were from the same day. Dude needs to slow his roll. This video made possible thanks to continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to this cognitive psychologist who is finding perverse joy in this role's title. Do not do what you hate. Okay. Just kidding. As maddening as these books can be, it is a fun job. It's a new rule, so let's see what was described in the overture for it. Rule 5 uses a single example drawn from my experience as a clinical psychologist to illustrate the personal and social necessity of attending to the dictates of conscience. I know how much you all love when he talks about his former clients, but at least I don't think this one would mind the exposure, which admittedly makes it a bit worse. Let's start with the chapter art. It's a guy with wings in a contorted pose with minimal garb up in the clouds. Recall, dear viewer, that the author of this book put forward that, quote, much information can be contained within an image without the viewer possessing any explicit understanding of its contents. So we should be able to glean much from just this picture. Right? This immediately read to me as Eris, the tragic Greek character who flew too close to the sun in his exuberant hubris, resulting in his wings melting off and him falling to his death. The story can be taken to illustrate the importance of the middle way, the balance between too much and too little of things in life. I asked my husband for his read of it, and his guess was, quote, the Greek guy with the melted wings. So that seems to be the consensus in this house, especially with Atlas being the subject of Rule 4's art, and more on that in a few. Why this guy is in the pose he's in, I'm less sure. Granted, it's a dynamic pose, albeit physically impossible, but more on that in a few too. But why? The best I can come up with is he's inviting the viewer to follow him up towards the sun and certain doom. Why his legs have to be like that, I don't know. Then I remembered. Peterson did a podcast interview with this book's artist, Juliette Fougras. I could check there.
And so that's Lucifer plummeting from heaven.
Yeah, that's the one.
Oh. Or that. Which I can see now, but as previously described, was not what I got out of it. In talking about this art, Fougras mentions that this was the only rule she read, as she didn't want the art to be a translation of the rule itself. She largely worked from the samples and multi-paragraph descriptions Peterson sent her. I'll throw in here that her work is a sort of collage style generally. For example, she said the image for Rule 1 involved over 100 separate pictures she pieced together. In talking about her making this image, Peterson comments,
And we went back and forth on this image quite a lot.
On this one? No. The only change here was that the hand was too long.
Right, arm length.
So let's talk about that now. As pointed out by Jose in his video on Peterson's picture book collab with Fougras, she sometimes plays fast and loose with anatomy.
Although I would also suggest the artist remember where her subject's arms are when creating the collage, because I have no idea what's going on with this nurse's arm. Where is her elbow and why is it bending like that?
And the longer I look at this, the less sense it makes. Lucy's right wing seems like it should attach in a place that makes sense, but then the left wing doesn't. Like from the height of the wingtips and uprightness of it, it seems like that wing would have to be longer to actually attach on his back. The bird's nest of a hairstyle is probably to suggest he's falling, but it looks more like a bad hairpiece attached to the side of his head. Or he's rocking an 80s synth style. No complaints about his left arm, but his right is wrong. The humerus is too short for how long the lower part of the arm is. But hey, Peterson wanted a shorter arm, so that's kind of on him, I guess. Lucy's chest is where things get ugly. It's like the entire torso is rotated not quite 90 degrees from where it should be. His abs are along the right side of his body, and his solitary nipple seems like it would be the left one from the source image, but is acting as his right one. The other one is MIA. Continuing down from there, his abs connect into his right hip, where some black magic happens to make the top and bottom connect like they do. I spent some time trying to get a comparison shot to be able to put my finger on what's wrong besides the torso. I even got some help from Max after changing pants to better see where my hips were. After going back and forth a bit between me and Lucy, it seems like the simplest way to say what's wrong is that the right leg scale is wrong. Not that the quads and whatnot look right, but that back leg is so tiny up at the top. Dr. Husband's suggestion was that the loincloth area was actually like from behind, so somebody's butt instead of the front, but I don't know, it's not right. Besides all that, if he is falling, his wings aren't communicating that. But I'm sure there's more to this I'm missing. Well, I've got this interview with the artist handy. Let's see what was up with those 3 women from the last rule's art. I had speculated those were Atlas's daughters, the Hesperides, but couldn't say why they were there. So, words straight from the lobster's mouth is...
Atlas.
Mm-hmm.
And there's 3 women in the background. Why?
That was part of your suggestion.
So I have to say why.
Yeah, Peterson, you have to say why.
Well, I would say that to the degree that men are properly shouldering their load, then women can rejoice and play in the background.
Yep. Some deep shit right there. Time to move on, lest we all ascend to his big brainery. Here's a quick refresher for the visual cues I use to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book, this means I'm responding to the book, and this means I'm talking about his references. This chapter is so meh. Like, it is basically an add-on to the last one. So, I don't really have anything additional to bring to the table research-wise, so I'm just going to talk about his references here. I'm not going to spend the hour it takes to shift everything over to the experiment cubes. Sorry. There is no science here. Okay, that's a bit harsh. Hal Pashler does some good stuff. Just Pearson's use of him is... suboptimal. Let's talk about those references, such as they are. The first is to Hamlet, because he quotes a line from it. The second and third are brought in during a bit of a tangent, talking about stuff his client did. Basically, the idea of learning styles and their purported benefits have been overblown. We aren't going to spend a lot of time on this client's story, so just know that Peterson was willing to devote 2 references to support something that's orthogonal to his advice. The fourth is to support an offhand comment that the client was less than keen about talking in front of large groups. Another point that forces me to question, under Peterson's system, what gets to have a reference and what doesn't, because it seems kind of random. So yeah, these references are about as useful as a social media site purchased by a man-child for an exorbitant price. Seriously? I'm not going to talk about these references again after this point. They're that superfluous. So, let us commence of the not doing things we hate. Right, so off the bat, let's talk about this client. I could have swore he'd talk about her in 12 Rules at some point, but for the life of me, I am not finding it. I even Control F'd my way through the PDF with the different keywords and still nothing. So if any of you happen to figure out where it is in here, let me know. One place he definitely has talked about this client was in a New York Times interview from 2018, following his Bill C-16 rise and the publication of 12 Rules. This client comes up when asked about what got him engaging in politics. When pressed by the interviewer for a specific example, he talks about this client who worked for a company who had a lengthy discussion over what to call those paper easels used at meetings, and in elementary schools. The email exchanges were debating if the term flip chart was offensive towards people from the Philippines. Wikipedia still has these described under an entry called flip chart, so it seems like this unidentified company did not change the broader terminology. We're just going to dive in with my commentary here, as I've kind of detailed everything that needs to be said about this client's work experience. Peterson naturally chalks this up to DEI and political correctness run amok, but I don't think it's quite that simple. Language is a complicated and evolving thing. And yeah, as society progresses, some words or terms may be deemed inappropriate to use. I could list off some examples, but I'd like to keep this channel monetized, so the curious can go out and do their own research. But it seems for many potentially or actually contentious words, the context it appears in is important. Members of certain groups who have worked to reclaim slurs have access to words that people outside those groups don't. A combination of morphemes in one language can mean an entirely different thing in another. I should be safe having these examples on screen, but I am not going to play them because, again, monetization is nice and the algorithm is really bad at context. I would argue that determining the offensiveness of the term flip chart needs to be done while keeping its context in mind. In this instance, we're sort of nouning the verb here, as it's a paper pad whose top page gets flipped when more blank space is needed. This isn't inherently invoking Filipinos, which makes it distinct from terms like those associated with ethnic slurs for stealing things from people, and there's a couple. And yeah, I know it's not up to a white bread home slice like me to determine what is or isn't offensive for people. So I looked around online, and best I could figure, it doesn't really seem like people from the Philippines are all that offended by flip chart. So this could be an instance of people trying to be inclusive and sensitive and accommodating and just kind of messing up, getting a little too eager. It certainly happens. I've been on the receiving end of this. Like some non-Catholic students telling me I need to apologize to the Catholic students in the class for saying that priests were human. And let's be real. Companies, by and large, are dumb organizations. There may be smart people in them. There may be a lot of smart people in them. But sometimes some really dumb decisions get made for some kind of idiotic reasons. I also fully acknowledge that I could be in the wrong here. If not now, then maybe 10 or 20 years in the future. There could be a change such that the term flip chart is recognized to be a properly offensive term. And if that's the case, then me of the now is sorry, I guess, and will use the appropriate phrase moving forward. I have no intention of dying on this hill. This chapter's first section is largely devoted to Peterson retelling this client's story of extreme hardship. So we're going to focus on the parts cogent to the advice. He notes, repeatedly, that this chart nomenclature is somewhat trivial in nature, and so many may just say to move on.
You could claim that paying attention to someone attending to such issues is as much a waste of time as attending to the discussion in the first place. And I would say that is precisely the conundrum Rule 5 is trying to address. When do you stop participating in a worrisome process that you see, or think you see, unfolding in front of you?
Eventually, he says that these things tend to add up to a, quote, coherent pattern associated with an ideology that was directional in its intent, explicitly and implicitly, which gets brought back around to his value hierarchy of labor thing, with the most valuable actions being dictated by our conscience.
We regard what we value as worthy of sacrifice and pursuit. That worthiness motivates us to act, despite the fact that action is difficult and dangerous. When we are called upon to do things that we find hateful and stupid, we are simultaneously forced to act contrary to the structure of values motivating us to move forward stalwartly and protecting us from dissolution into confusion and terror.
Hateful and stupid. In case I hadn't made it clear, he's talking about the diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff here. This, coming from a guy who, since coming back from his self-imposed exile, has taken it upon himself to misgender and or dead-name trans and or non-binary people at seemingly every opportunity.
To thine own self be true, as Polonius has it in Shakespeare's Hamlet. That self, that integrated psyche, is in truth the ark that shelters us when the storms gather and the water rises. To act in violation of its precepts, its fundamental beliefs, is to run our own ship onto the shoals of destruction. To act in violation of the precepts of that fundamental self is to cheat in the game we play with ourselves, to suffer the emptiness of betrayal, and to perceive abstractly and then experience in embodied form the loss that is inevitable to come.
So about that Shakespeare quote. Yeah, it's generally good advice, which is why it's stuck around as a sort of meme. But, as Peterson points out, it's said by Polonius to his son who's headed off to uni. Polonius, who was apparently mocked by his kids while saying this in staging. Polonius, who sends someone to spy on that son he's sending off. Polonius, who set things in motion that lead to his daughter Ophelia's suicide. Polonius, who gets killed by Hamlet because he was spying on a conversation Ham was having with his mom. In context, it's part of a boring, kind of contradictory speech from a hypocritical man. I have to ask, what loss? In the paragraph that follows, he talks about his client feeling shitty about her job after the email chain, so this loss could possibly be something along those lines. That seems like such a profound statement, an inevitable loss from not being true to yourself. So it kind of needs more clarity. It's almost funny he brought up Polonius, as this being true to yourself advice he's giving is what trans and non-binary people are trying to do, but he is adamantly against it. Finally, he's just going to drop in this Jungian idea of the integrated psyche with no explanation. Seeing as how that integration is the goal of Jung's psychodynamic therapeutic approach, something which is theoretically only achievable after much work of untangling your unconscious, it seems almost careless to throw it about so casually. He commends the client for being wise, for not confronting her bosses about the naming issue, which seems to kind of fly in the face of his oft-repeated advice. That it is your moral obligation to speak truth to the tyrannical powers, lest things doom spiral into gulags and chaos. But it's okay, guys, this time, because she devoted her energy into trying to get her bosses to knock it off with learning styles, and even goes through some of the logic of why there's not empirical support for it, complete with 2 references. Yeah, learning styles are a discredited idea. I'd even use Peterson's reference here to support that claim. But as they say, even a stopped timekeeping lobster device can be right twice a day. It seems a bit tangential to his point, but hey, spreading some knowledge is good, I suppose. He tries to play up her bravery for not confronting her tyrannical bosses, and instead focusing her energies on things like public speaking. Then there's the doom spirals of not correcting a corrupt culture because it's important to get the practice when the consequences are small. Ooh, title drop.
Part of moving beyond order is knowing when you have such a reason. Part of moving beyond order is understanding that your conscience has a primary claim on your action which supersedes your conventional social duty. If you decide to stand up and refuse a command, if you do something of which others disapprove but you firmly believe to be correct, you must be in a position to trust yourself.
He seems to have to put things in this grandiose framing. But I don't disagree with the sentiment. It's hard when you have to fight for something you know is right, especially if the power structure is actively fighting against you. You really have to be able to trust yourself and know what you're doing is right. That said, I'm a little unclear on what this conventional social duty is. I suppose this is a style-mad way of saying if your conscience conflicts with what is being expected of you, you should go with your conscience. And he's not making this connection explicitly, so I'll do it. This beyond order business means that, by going against society or culture, we would be engaging in a chaotic act. But don't panic, little lobsters. It is for the greater ordered good.
Shut it!
There's more to this paragraph, and I mostly just agreed with him, so you know what that means.
This means that you must have attempted to live an honest, meaningful, productive life of precisely the sort that might characterize someone else you would tend to trust. If you have acted honorably, so that you are a trustworthy person, it will be your decision to refuse to comply or to act in a manner contrary to public expectation that will help society itself maintain its footing. By doing so, you can be part of the force of truth that brings corruption and tyranny to a halt. The sovereign individual, awake and attending to his or her conscience, is the force that prevents the group, as the necessary structure guiding normative social relations, from becoming blind and deadly.
This reminds me of the primary complaint I had with a similar sentiment in the original 12 rules, Rule 6. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. You can only stand up for what's right if your house is in perfect order. Thing is, as I said then, that's setting the threshold way too high. No one is a saint. If we held social progress to this standard, nothing would ever change. Another thing about this that's leaving a bad taste in my mouth, aside from using the somewhat loaded term of a sovereign individual, is this force of truth bit. It seems very post hoc, after the fact. History decides the truth sort of thing. He likes to bring up the going to say it, but that period of Germany or the Soviet gulags as examples of tyrannical leaders and states. He's even gone so far as to say that you would have gone along with things in that way if you were in Germany at the time. And yeah, granted, there was a fair bit of indifference at what was going on and where people were being taken to, but not everyone was indifferent. And many people were killed for opposing things. Those people's force of truth wasn't enough to bring corruption and tyranny to a halt. A massive war did. Some people were trying to prevent what happened, but there's only so much you can do when the power structure is seized through deadly force. And yeah, sure, he's not directly bringing any of that in here. I feel like with how much of an emphasis it's been in his lectures and interviews in the previous book, it's absolutely in the subtext. So this quote feels like it's victim blaming, that the people of Germany hadn't opposed things hard enough, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. But if you look at how the rise to power happened, there were a series of events where the average person had no chance of affecting things. I think I'm so mad about this because it seems like we're right on the edge of this happening right now in the US. We know the shit Trump pulled, we know what the people under him tried to do to help him seize power, and we kind of lucked out of it working. It doesn't mean that he or somebody like him won't try again and possibly succeed. But why bother with all the little fiddly bits of history? It's so much easier to say that everyone in Germany at the time was enough because Adolf was able to become a dictator. Moving on. He says, quote, I do not want to end this section on a falsely optimistic note. I'm shocked at this moment of awareness for how much hype and certainty he can spin his advice with. His client bounced around between jobs a bit, and one she was actually happy at later off eventually. Subsequent ones were also, quote, thoroughly possessed by the current linguistic and identity politics fads.
Some dragons are everywhere, and they are not easy to defeat. But her attempts to fight back, her work debunking pseudoscientific theories, her work as a journalist, helped buttress her against depression and bolster her self-regard.
It's like he knows for the majority of people, his advice isn't going to result in some world-altering cultural shift, but he has to talk it up like it will. I would think that would be bad for people's self-regard, that they aren't living up to Lobster Daddy's expectations of their potential. It's been a bit since this has come up, but we are once again met with a metaphor consistent with a chaos forest surrounding an order city. We need to shore up the defenses of Order City to best protect it from the chaos forest surrounding us. I'm watching you. His advice puts us on the straight and narrow path between order and chaos, my fucking ass. Do your best to inoculate yourself against the style madness that's coming down the tracks. We'll clear it for a little bit after this section, and then get right back into it, but just hug your loved ones. We're going in.
When culture disintegrates, because it refuses to be aware of its own pathology, because a visionary hero is absent, it descends into the chaos that underlies everything. Under such conditions, the individual can dive voluntarily as deeply as he or she dares into the depths and rediscover the eternal principles renewing vision and life. The alternative is despair, corruption, and nihilism, thoughtless subjugation to the false words of totalitarian utopianism and life as a miserable, lying, and resentful slave.
Right, yeah, that all totally makes sense. In case you're not catching I don't think they're dog whistles because he's pretty transparent about it. The verbal flags here, when he's talking about totalitarian utopians, he's talking about progressives. It's probably why he led this chapter with the client story he did. She was thoughtlessly subjugated to their debate about what to call those stupid meeting accessories. And the lying part is pretty clearly, at least to me, about his whole compelled speech shtick about people's pronouns. The tyrants.
Because you know it's been long overdue a challenge, the trans community.
Funny that the style madness would get so deep when talking about, basically, the collective unconscious, another proposed but not empirically supported concept from Jung. The depths he's saying we should dive to when surrounded by, progressives, are the contents of the collective unconscious, the hypothetical warehouse of knowledge built up by all of our ancestors, accessible to us unconsciously. So this is another way to say, use the wisdom of our ancestors because they're smarter than us in the most Jung way possible. While we're here, I guess this is more order submersible, chaos ocean.
You can always return to the caress of our dark mother, the sea, whose salty embrace envelops every contour of your naked body.
Where was I? Right. Doom. Of course, it's the oatmeal raisin cake of doom with the gluten-free corruption flour and the vegan nihilism icing. Your only possible mode of existence in the world the progressives want to build is as a, quote, miserable, lying, resentful slave. How else could having things like universal basic income, healthcare, and a livable planet come to be?
If you wish instead to be engaged in a great enterprise, even if you regard yourself as a mere cog, you are required not to do things you hate. You must fortify your position, regardless of its meanness or littleness. Confront the organizational mendacity undermining your spirit, face the chaos that ensues, rescue your near-dead father from the depths, and live a genuine and truthful life. Otherwise, nature hides her face, society stultifies, and you remain a marionette with your strings pulled by demonic forces operating behind the scenes. And one more thing, it is your fault. No one is destined in the deterministic sense to remain a puppet.
There's, That's a loaded paragraph. The great enterprise is almost certainly the creative conservative society he's been pining all over this book for. Not doing the things you hate. Okay, so don't do what your conscience doesn't want you doing, which was the big point of the last chapter. But he also said we'll fight against our conscience, which seems like it would indicate that at some point prior to following his advice, we'd hate following our conscience. So cute. Love that little logical trap for us. Blah blah chaos, blah blah dead dad, blah blah truthful life. This puppet thing showed up in the last chapter, a la Pinocchio, but I'm kind of getting anti-Semitic vibes this time around. Probably because of the demonic forces behind the scenes orchestrating everything. Also love that we're exiting this with the assurance the badness is our fault. With the recent change in Floridian history curriculum, it would seem that, from this, Peterson would want to add that the enslaved people were at fault for remaining such. Peterson's mixing it up. Instead of sending us off on the maybe train, we get to ride the if line. The setup for this is that even when you're down, you may still find useful weapons against an enemy who isn't as powerful as you thought they were, so you'd best fight back.
If you are willing to conceptualize yourself as someone who could, and perhaps more importantly, should stand fast, you may begin to perceive the weapons at your disposal. If what you are doing is causing you to lash out at others impulsively, if what you are doing is destroying your motivation to move forward, if your actions and inactions are making you contemptuous of yourself and worse, of the world, if the manner in which you conduct your life is making it difficult for you to wake happily in the morning, if you are plagued by a deep sense of self-betrayal, perhaps you are choosing to ignore that still small voice, inclined as you may be to consider it something only attended to by the weak and naive. If you are at work and called upon to do what makes you contemptuous of yourself, more repetition of the negatives from the last paragraph and beyond. It is possible that it is time to meditate, consider, strategize, and place yourself in a position where you are capable of saying no.
The way I've got this set up, you won't see it, but there's a footnote attached to the no. It basically says you need to say no 3 times. Anything less than that, and you haven't established a pattern. No word on whether or not 4 times is right out.
Perhaps you will garner additional respect from the people you are opposing on moral grounds, even though you may still pay a high price for your actions. Perhaps they will even come to rethink their stance, if not now, with time, as their own consciences might be plaguing them in the same still small manner.
The framing here strikes me as weird. Like, you're still getting axed, metaphorically or literally, for standing up for what you believe is right. But at least the one axing you might have a bit of grudging respect for what you did. Yeah, there may be consequences for not going along with things, but I don't think the respect of your opposition should necessarily factor into your decision. I guess this could maybe help encourage somebody to act, but come on, man. Don't put your self-esteem or self-respect in other people's hands, especially like this. Plus, the strange optimistic spin. They may not change their minds now, but they might in the future, so that's nice. In my experience, and to the best of my knowledge, the people or organizations I've had to fight against did not rethink their stance. Realistically, it's usually more so that my actions demonstrate how right they were about me. What a fitting section title. He's actually going to give practical advice here. For a little bit, at least. Similar to the start of the previous chapter, his emphasis here is on your job. Specifically, if you aren't happy at your current one, start the, quote, difficult, demanding, and often unrewarding search for a new one, and notes that you only have to be successful once. That's followed by a short maybe train of you maybe finding a job that isn't soul-crushing, and maybe listening to your conscience about what work you should be doing will help reduce your sense of self-betrayal. You'll see this as we continue, but he does an interesting flip between not sugarcoating the realities of job hunting, but then being, in his words, falsely optimistic about the new job's fit. You only have to be successful once can be true, if you're lucky, but it can also be true that the new job is worse than your old one. But it is sort of nice to see that some of his advice for former clients could be practical in nature. It wasn't all just chaos dragons and doom cookies. He goes through several fears people might have about job searching, like being afraid to move or being afraid that new companies won't want to hire you. In the framing of facing tyranny and the Jews' 40-year exile, he encourages the reader to weigh the costs of staying versus switching, as well as just building their skill set. Also, the rejection rate he told his clients to expect was about 50-1, which seems kind of optimistic in my experience, and there's just gonna be cat noises. I just want to pause a moment to say that encouraging people to switch from a job that is soul-killing is reasonable advice, albeit advice that needs to be couched a bit. Life is expensive, so if you're the primary breadwinner for your family, I understand having trepidations about jumping into the unknowns of a new job. Also, it's kind of assuming that you would be able to financially afford a move. Not everyone can. But I've seen what being in a terrible job environment can do to a person, and the consequences of being afraid to leave. My dad was a system administrator for a school district that ran on a very tight budget, to put it nicely. When I was young, he mostly enjoyed his work. He had to do some sketchy shit periodically, like go into the system and fiddle with the dates because, oops, we haven't paid for the license this month. We'll get to that soon. But he mostly enjoyed his job, like being able to help teachers or interact with the students around the server room. Yeah, room. This was in the days when you had magnetic tapes and those huge servers, and it was an entire room that had to be kept Arctic cold. But the winds changed at some point, and his boss noticed. So she left to a different school district in a different state, and she offered to take my dad with her. I don't entirely know why, but he stayed, and I think it was probably due to that fear. Fear of change, fear of the new job falling through, fear of not being able to support his family. In any event, he stayed put. And in exchange for his loyalty, the school district started the process of Miltoning him. Yay, the server hardware got upgraded so it can all fit on one rack, but then it and he got moved into a shoebox office tucked away from everyone. And then they moved it out of the school and into the district's main office, but not in the main office, in a portable. It was terrible for him. The parts of the job he enjoyed were gradually stripped away until he had nothing. And while I don't think this was a contributing factor to him dying at 50, it certainly took a massive toll on his quality of life. What happened to my dad is why I've been willing to take the kind of scary steps I have been in my life. Standing up to my advisor about not applying to faculty jobs at Christian universities as an atheist, doing what I thought was right, and getting said advisor removed from my dissertation committee because he was being obstructive and wasn't going to let me finish, as terrible as that fight was. Moving to a different country with no idea what I'd be doing for work or the impact it would have on my career because I wanted to be with my husband. I may not be in the career track I imagined 15 or even 10 years ago, but I'm not in a job I hate or trying to make a long-distance relationship work. And I totally admit I am incredibly privileged and lucky for things to have worked out like they have. We certainly aren't living on what I'm financially contributing to things, but we're getting by. I guess my point with all of this is, if you are in a job you hate and are in a position to switch, if you can financially swing it, it may be worth taking that leap of faith and trying something new. Now, let's get back to Peterson, just in time for him to make it weird. He notes that you may not be getting job offers because you need to work on your skills.
You cannot effectively pronounce no in the presence of corrupt power when your options to move are non-existent. In consequence, you have a moral obligation to place yourself in a position of comparative strength and to do then what is necessary to capitalize on that strength.
And eventually again saying that, quote, you need to win the lottery only once, so get applying. Yeah. To negotiate for better pay or be able to be selected from the applicant pool, you need to have something the employer wants or something they don't want to lose. But this saying no to corrupt power and moral obligation to get the negotiating upper hand, there's never small acts in the lobster universe. It's always a cosmic struggle against the tyrannical order dragons. Seemingly talking to the stereotype of a millennial worker, he clarifies that he's not talking about hating your job because it makes you wake up early, makes you leave the house, or do menial tasks, and that last one has some interesting phrasing, so let's dip back in there.
It is not a matter of frustration generated when you are called on to do things that are menial or necessary, such as emptying garbage cans, sweeping floors, cleaning bathrooms, or in any other manner taking your lowly but well-deserved place at the bottom of the hierarchy of competence, even of seniority. Resentment generated by such necessary work is most often merely ingratitude, inability to accept lowly place at the beginning, unwillingness to adopt the position of the fool, or arrogance and lack of discipline. Refusal of the call of conscience is by no means the same thing as irritation about undesirably low status.
Oh no, this millennial has been thoroughly roasted. It burns. I am destroyed. The thing that immediately jumped out at me here is that he's basically describing things associated with the term office housework. And the thing about those tasks is, women and people of color tend to be stuck doing these sorts of tasks that are technically below their job description more than their equivalently tenured or qualified white male peers. People in that situation have every right to be pissed off. Let's just call it what it is. They're being discriminated against because of their ethnicity or gender. There's no ingratitude or inability to accept a lowly place at the beginning. They've moved past the beginning, but they're still being treated like they're new. Same for arrogance or lack of discipline. People being forced into doing these tasks should be fucking irritated about the undesirably low status. Dipshit. Granted, if you are just starting out, yeah, you're probably going to have to get some experience and peck your way up that local hierarchy. My first research job was cleaning rat cages, after all. That doesn't mean I should have expected to keep cleaning rat cages exclusively, as I acquired more experience and degrees. Oh, we wouldn't be wrapping up a chapter if he didn't let the style mad monster off the chain. And just, I know it's going to seem like I skipped something there between this quote and the previous one, but I didn't. That's how it goes.
That rejection, that betrayal of the soul, is truly the requirement to perform demonstrably counterproductive, absurd, or pointless work, to treat others unjustly and to lie about it, to engage in deceit, to betray your future self, to put up with unnecessary torture and abuse, and to silently watch others suffer the same treatment.
Okay, so the office housework I brought up, would that fit his requirements here or no? It's counterproductive for professionals to be fetching coffee orders or playing office mom to their colleagues. So for some definitions of betraying their future self, it would. But I'm not sure he'd see it that way. Adding on to that, concepts like unjust treatment or torture and abuse are vague. Things I'd put under those labels, guys in the old boys club would say is just part of the office culture, so toughen up, buttercup, if you want to run with the big dogs. Ugh. It's a bit of a dead horse joke at this point, but I'll stop kicking that horse when it starts happening. Where is the speech precision, Dr. P?
That rejection is the turning of a blind eye and the agreement to say and do things that betray your deepest values and make you a cheat at your own game. And there is no doubt that the road to hell, personally and socially, is paved not so much with good intentions as with the adoption of attitudes and undertaking of actions that inescapably disturb your conscience. Do not do what you hate.
I don't know. Seems like there's all kinds of pavers on the roadway to hell. Good intentions, conscience disturbers, outright malice. But we're still facing the consequences of one of my complaints from the original rules. There isn't much connective tissue between the different chapters. So bringing up vision and games for the billionth time is technically a through line, but I don't know. It feels like an afterthought. Just tacked on to give it that continuity. One of the biggest closing thoughts I have for this chapter is kind of akin to Capgras syndrome. The Peterson who wrote this chapter isn't totally the same Peterson that wrote everything else. There were forays into the style-mad swamps or grand gestures about the effects on culture, but the bulk of it was relatively grounded, to the point that I didn't feel compelled to include the reasonable stuff as quotes, just the weirder stuff. Hell, this chapter was straightforward enough, I was able to condense everything down into one video. Something I haven't been able to do since the last book's Rule 12. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. Although I do have to say that in my professional lobster studying opinion, it seems like part of this brevity came about as a consequence of him showing uncharacteristic restraint in what he talked about. Going through the quotes, he could have expanded on things in similar ways to what he had in 12 Rules. Like the whole attention as vision a la Osiris in 12 Rules, or calling back to it from earlier this book. To actually explain the integrated psyche and how doing a job you hate would impede the individuation process, as much as it pains me to say that. Like, I'm glad he didn't, because then I'd need to fully talk about it again, but as it stands, there's important info missing. He had many opportunities to dig into the consequences, as he sees them, of someone blindly following orders and the importance of refusing those commands. It was shocking he didn't bring up Solzhenitsyn at any point in this. The Gulag discussion came up in the 12 Rules mirror to this point. How many times had he acted against his own conscience, engaging in actions that he knew to be wrong? How many times had he betrayed himself and lied? It's the same stuff, just in different packaging. I mean, this quote even has the ability to say no thing that we saw in 12 Rules, that the Gulag guards had lost the ability to say no and refuse orders. He also didn't take the opportunity for the dumb wordplay that drove me up the wall in 12 Rules. Like this emergency bit about how emergencies are the emergencies of the ever-lurking chaos dragon and just, ugh. It was surprising to me he didn't do the same sort of thing with disintegrates, as it could be written disintegrates, which would then loop back into the integrated psyche bit, and just, I probably shouldn't be giving anybody ideas here. And this might be setting us up for another monkey's paw wish fulfillment, but I wish he would be more consistent about looping in the chapter art. He spent a bit of time doing it for Rule 2, and yeah, I gave him some shit about it, but it wasn't because he was doing it, it's because he was talking bollocks. The other rules, the topic of the art was part of his discussion at some point in the chapter, which sort of scratches this itch. The flaws of that approach were made pretty clear earlier this video though, with the big question of what's up with those women being what sounded like a bit of an ass pull. If he'd done something in text, maybe it wouldn't have felt as quite so pulling of the ass. But here, a character I assumed was Icarus even after reading the chapter, but is actually supposed to be the chief fallen angel? Where is it in text? He is not going to like my attempt at justification here, I'm sure. Especially as it's filtered through what I've gained through cultural osmosis, and not through a thorough reading of his beloved Paradise Lost. If we take Lucifer as the angel most able to question God on what he was doing, and as a force behind people getting free will, then he is almost the avatar for this chapter. The one willing to stand up to tyrannical order and say no. The one who supplied people with the ability to choose to say no. By making this a choice, did Lucy open up the way for humans to be truly good?
What is better, to be born good, or to overcome your evil nature through great effort?
But that's enough meandering through the shallow end of this style-mad swamp. Let's wrap this up so we can get to the doozy of the next rule. Broadly, the advice in this chapter wasn't bad. If you're miserable at your job, it may be in your best interest to find a new one. Do what you need to do to make that a reality, if you can. We don't need to bog that advice down in a culture war or moral obligations or anything of that nature. Although, all of that stuff does add to the page count of an already pretty short chapter. Also, just a reminder, because it's kind of funny, the inciting incident for this chapter was a work email chain about what to call flip charts. Sometimes you have to pick your battles. What's next, you might be wondering? Well, here's a hint. It's the rule he said San Francisco needed the most out of the 12 in this book. Abandon all ideology, ye who enter here. Until next time, bye.